Hello everyone, today we talk about the Longobard invasion and Justinian's successors. First of all, I would like to say that in spite of the title, this video is not specifically dedicated to Longobard history per se, but it's part of the series, the manualistic series specifically, about Byzantine history. There is a whole playlist dedicated to the Longobards, to which this video will be added as well. And this is surely a topic that we'll have to discuss in detail in many other videos. As you know, the Longobards were my first love. I actually would like to start a series at some point based on my bachelor thesis, 160 pages dedicated to their military history. There is enough food for several videos at that point. Still haven't started that. And I say this because today we will take a look, as a summary to actually several things. We will offer, first of all, a background of what was going on in the Roman Empire at the time to introduce better the matter. We'll talk about the Longobards per se, in part their origins, the settlement, and the ensuing wars with the Byzantines. And we will also talk about the boundaries of Longobard and Byzantine Italy, which is a topic that some of you came up sometimes saying, why don't you, do it in detail, because apparently you are interested in single localities and seeing how the thing was. That's also interesting. We'll do it today, but always taking into consideration that it's going to be brief, right? And that there is actually a lot to say, reason for which we will have to make necessarily tens of videos about Longobard history, which is very overlooked, misunderstood, and today historiography has made enough clarity to have an intelligent read of this this chapter that otherwise at a popular level is really like sometimes it doesn't even exist, right? People do not even care, but also the way they usually deal with it is mostly either it's very ideological, to say the least, mostly from kind of the Byzantine side of the aisle, but there are actually also from the Germanic one, but we have to be the third way is largely ignored at a popular level. Today maybe we will address something that I have already discussed broadly in those other videos of Longobard history. So let's simply start with this. So in the 40 years that followed Justinian's death, 4 emperors followed one another on the throne. Right, the first one was Justin II, 565-578, who was Justinian's nephew. He had easily managed to impose himself at court, even though Justinian had not appointed any successor. His death, Justin II was rather unstable. He soon gave signs of mental derangement, so the government was assumed by the Empress Sophia, who was Theodora's niece, and that in 574 had convinced Justin to appoint as Caesar, so as the heir of the Augustus, that was basically the idea, the comes excubitorum Tiberius, that would have in fact followed at his death as Augustus. In fact, Tiberius II, 578-582, reigned for this brief time, as you understand, and he also had no heirs, so he associated in turn to himself as Augustus the comes excubitorum Maurice, 582-602, that was a valiant general of Cappadocian origin, that had obtained already by the time brilliant achievements against the Persians, and the reign of which was brutally interrupted after a military revolt that brought on the throne a lesser officer named Phocas. who reigned from 600 to 610. And in the same years of the Byzantine Empire, there was a deep crisis, right? The first symptoms of which had already been felt since the end of Justinian's reign, with the substantial failure of the reforms and the disintegration of the military apparatus. And the same reconquest of the West, about which we made, like, I think 4 videos at least. You can find this stuff all in the Byzantine history playlist. Revealed itself to be fragile fundamentally, and especially due to the excessive expansion of the borders that weakened the possibilities of defense. There's a huge historiographical debate about this. I personally think that everything was fine as long as the plague didn't kick in, and that altogether wasn't a bad idea, as most historians actually say, But let's say Justinian's political legacy was rather heavy for his successors, because he had been a giant objective from a political point of view. He had managed to reassert, centrality of them. Also, ideologically speaking, he strengthened further control in society. So this enormous system, however, had a great cost, right? The government was in a critical situation, especially the finances were disastered, and also the spending sprees, obliged by, necessary at the same time to maintain war on different fronts, both in the West and in the East, had caused this major state of instability. And that's where the collapse, in part, happened. There is no determinism in this, right? Things might have gone differently, but let's say that the situation, especially on the Western frontier, had gone deteriorating faster, especially after the plague, because there had been the major demographic and economical crack that had struck exactly the centers that were meant to, as an object of the reconquest, had been meaning to provide the bulk, the solidity to those same conquests, right? It wasn't a mistake that we made this analysis, both from a political and strategical point of view, to reconquer places like Italy, like Africa, like even as far as Spain, right? The Byzantines had the mean, especially after the rebuilding of their fleet in the last generations, to reachieve this. It was feasible even to control and hold those territories, right? But the crisis there brought to the, it was better than nothing, right? You would say the expenses were excessive. Well, if the plague had not struck, this might have not been so evident as such, because after all, these territories were productive and they would remain, right? So even the idea of the big fracture afterwards as a sort of constant decline of the situation wasn't much a matter of local even structures or infrastructures. It was rather political, right? The insane empire wasn't stable because of its nature, in a sense, at the head, right, of the state, and that was a problem that hadn't much to do with the expansion per se, right? It is true that this situation had surely, the reconquest had broadened the possibilities of instability, but it had also brought in a lot of resources, and the events that followed were largely, unpredictable, and powers at that time were just trying to struggle to survive, and expanding boundaries and consolidating more income on a longer term, what was objectively the best move, especially considering the intrinsic weakness of the peoples that had been conquered. I'd say at least the collapse of Vandal Africa, of Ostrogothic Italy, was justifying the operations. That how things went Italy afterwards were not much because of a matter of the Romans had won, right? Then eventually, apparently, at least, things went wrong because in terms of leadership, there were a lot of mistakes, distrust, etc. So the Ostrogoths revolted again. But for that matter, the Byzantine army displayed their capacity of superiority that these other peoples could not, oppose themselves more than much to, right? At least in the original meaning, because here it's all intertwined to the proper time in which this had happened, right? The same plague had struck in moments where, things were transforming in a sense. But whatever. But just to make an example of what we're talking about, and given that today we talk about the Longobards, first of all, let's point out that in Spain, in 569, there was a Visigothic counteroffensive that pushed the Imperials up to the coast, from which they would have been expelled some year later. Right, even in here, the Visigothic kingdom was a bit of a mess. At this time, it was still kind of functional, but the degree of privatization, especially in the far south, where these operations were taking place, is actually very fascinating to observe. We talked about the Visigothic kingdom, Visigothic military at the same time. Africa was troubled by local revolts, indigenous revolts mostly. Some say, why didn't they leave the Vandals actually in charge of Africa? Well, there's a bit of a thorn in the side considering the importance of Africa itself as a granary, rather. So that was necessary just to, what did Belisarius could, just subdue the Vandals, then leaving them and going to Sicily, to Italy, and pretending they would have stayed fine. Of course, they had to knock him out. Of course, they also, just like it happened in the same Italy, etc., they resettled, the same Vandals had been defeated because they were precious labor and fighting force in the frontier with the Berbers. And rather, Africa was a problem, and would be, just even if you know later history, for example, the rise of Heraclius and all this stuff, because, it became, naturally was an autonomous area, kind of militarized. There were actual rebellions coming from there that even knocked out emperors Constantinople from the throne. But surely these local troubles costed also the empire money, right? Troops. And it's in this context that Italy was invaded by the Longobards, by whom was inflicted the harshest blow, indeed, to the Justinian success, overwhelming great part of the territory that had been recovered after the Gothic War. I also made a video, we made a couple of videos for now, I think, just about the Longobards and the Slavs, commenting the strategicon of the Pseudo-Mauritius. That's very important because for the Longobards, it's actually, the so-called, the blonde-haired peoples that include a bit all the Germans, apparently. But objectively, in those times, the ones we're talking here now, and especially before the Islamic invasions, the Longobards represented a very important presence in the Byzantine Empire, not just as enemies, but actually also as mercenaries and allies, right? There were large numbers of Longobards that remained, were used also in the Balkans, even as far as Armenia. We know consistent numbers. The same Italy was actually half, same Longobard Italy was a bit half and half, especially before Authori's time. Many Longobards were actually properly Summacoi, federati, and that's also an aspect that is usually overlooked about the same Longobard migration. So we'll try to talk about this a bit better now. So the Longobards, speaking of the origins specifically, were a very were a people who was known to the Romans since antiquity, right? This is something rare. Normally, all the other Germanic peoples were unknown, right? There are a few exceptions where you find an ethnonym that when, Tiberius invaded Germany, he found these people already known as the Longobards on the lower Elbe, and these lived on throughout all the migration era, where most Germanic peoples were actually creating a new name of confederacies that didn't exist before, and that actually included previous tribes. The Longobards objectively have an extremely fascinating history. For anybody who knows Germanistics, but basically they're the most important people as far as understanding, the origins of, Germanic culture, these traditions, etc. The enormous problem of the Traditionskern, of the ethnic identity of the Germans, that today we will not address specifically. But the Longobards are, in this sense, an exception that proves consistently a northern origin of these people, a substantially, there's been a certain historiography that has tended to say, okay, these were also mixed, that we don't actually know how they were, but okay, they were mixed. No, we don't know how much they were mixed. We know they were very mixed, but even just certain cultural indicators that reveal, for example, a great steppes influence do not actually tell us how much these people were actually blended with others. Especially in the case of the Longobards, there is a bit this sense of, oh yes, they were so mixed, they were globetrotters. Not quite. Like, if you follow the Longobard migration, they basically stuck to Central Europe all the time, right? We're not like the Goths. They're surely very influenced by them. They surely took a lot of refugees from the times of the Hunnic invasions. We know by fact that at the time of the Longobard migration in Italy, that next to this so-called Germanic bulk, there were lots of Sarmatians, even Romanized populations of the previous, of Pannonia, of other lands they had occupied. Turks, Slavs, even. There are very interesting Saxons, by the way, Thuringians. There was a lot of number of that. There are certain tomes, certain genetic material, analyzed in Italian Longobard Italian tomes that reveal sometimes very close ties to, for example, the Anglo-Saxons with British DNA, with because the were Saxons and the Longobards were quite similar. They were Alp Germans, by the way, with modern Polish people, and this is not surprising given that at this time from migration from Moravia, the Slavs were already basically on their heels in a sense. So this is very fascinating. If it ever happens to you to visit certain museums like archaeological, in Cividale, for example, northeastern Italy, you find these guys were basically very influenced by steppes culture. The Huns had especially impacted them. The Longobards remained very long time under them. Were probably the last people who abandoned Attila's successors. They're horse archers. I've inserted here even some picture of literally what these people were the first generation they came. And this is brutally beautiful. Also because they came from around the Balaton, at least that's what they gathered, Pannonia, today's Hungary, in the steppe, literally. And you find, even from their famous scale armor, etc., basically what a warrior at the time looked like identically from the Pannonian steppe to the Bering Strait. Right, they're the same thing. Basically Asian. In military culture, as you would define, and that's what that doesn't tell you, however, what was the DNA there, and that that this military culture were very blended, and this Eastern Asian influences are notorious, right? Even in Germany, it lasted so long. In general, the Avars eventually that were also pretty similar in terms of material culture. Of course, differently from German. Let's not stress too much. You can distinguish that these were something different from a Central Asian people. Of course, there are very powerful indicators, but the elites, right? These were copying basically those models because they were more fitting to their own kind of autocratic, centralizing pushes that, in the case of the Longobards, were very contained, because the Longobards had a very strong middle class of freemen that had also managed to crush other Germanic peoples were more unbalanced in that point of view. We made a video on the Japs recently that instead had, for example, a very rich but very narrow elite, and the freemen had lost, strength, and the Longobards crushed them at some point, plausibly because of that as well, all alone. And we know that the Longobards were very many. They were basically the largest migration right there. Compared to the Italian population, they were just from 1 to 3%, so they were not so impacting, if not in certain specific areas where there is still genetic evidence of a higher, especially fairer concentration in the Italian peninsula. But Italy, in spite of the plague and the destructions, etc., were still, consistently populated, and actually, contrarily to this usually believed, the Longobards contributed to give a hell of a great stability to it. any kind of idea these were barbarians, bloodthirsty. This is just an historiographical invention, right? These surely they were savages in the sense that, of course, these were warlike peoples. They were tribal. They didn't know. So that there was something else, right? They were even archaeologically speaking, the first generation displaced. Yes, these were Northern Europeans. They were known since the first century of Christian era as inhabitants of northern Germany. There's no doubt about that. But they immediately blended in, and they managed to give unity to a kingdom in a way that we will understand better when especially studying Longobard history, that we already addressed and explained in a sense, but that, of course, thanks to Romanization, but also to the maintenance of certain specific Germanic characteristics, especially from a political and institutional point of view, right? The Longobards Germanized Italy from a cultural point of view. And the reason being that, differently from France or Spain, the Gothic War had basically created a great break, right, with local traditions. The latifundium had disappeared, so all these medium landowners, etc., all kind of contributed to the Longobard, enterprise, because they, just like the late Goths, like Totti, they were presenting now the ideas such as freeing the slaves and all this stuff to counter properly the Byzantine system of the latifundium, still of the late antique idea, right? That there is one dominus, and then lots of serfs that just work for the thousands and thousands. The Longobards managed to win over the Italian populations, right? And we know that also because from the Byzantine areas there were people fleeing into Longobard territory to live there, because the empire had a much greater tax pressure. So the myth of the Longobards ruining everything is actually false. The Longobards had a dramatic cultural legacy in the history of Europe that is radically overlooked. Basically, the revival of Roman law all comes from Longobardist jurists. We have explained this in those videos, for example, about medieval law. The Longobards created a kingdom, right? A unitary kingdom was the only functional one in an elective sense in Western Europe. They were revered by the Franks. The Franks considered the Longobards just their only peer, because differently from others that had basically all winked at idea of Romanity, of imperiality, the Longobards stuck from a political and institutional point of view to Germanic identity and never bought the imperial model. So this was they were respected. Alboin, famously enough, is a very famous figure in his memory in the sagas. It's one of the great heroes of the Germanic epic. There is so much about these people that they really informed the way Europe is in many ways. The Carolingians drew help. Famously enough, the most important Carolingian kingdom was the Kingdom of Italy, the kingdom of the Longobards, that not only contained Rome, but was also the one working on a public base, on cities, with literate elites, right? Something completely unknown to the Franks. They tried to replicate it in the north, but of course didn't have any pre-existing base. The importance is huge, right, both for Germanistic, both for later cultural developments. There's so much in here that it is being dramatically overlooked. But here we're talking about the very beginnings, right? And as far as the Romans are concerned, the Longobards were present at, I don't know, for example, when Arminius died, or was assassinated back in the day, the Longobards, even if they were small, but apparently were so warlike, according to sources, that at some point rose to prominence in Germany, mediating, kind of managing the thing. They participated with the Marcomannian, the Danubian raids, etc. At a certain point, the Romans crushed them together with these incursions, and they disappear from the Roman radar in the Barbaricum, together as with many other peoples that we know nothing about, because of course archaeology doesn't have tags, so if historical sources do not talk about them, we know basically nothing about them. We have just an idea what was the archaeological, groups there that, the groups that we can archaeologically track. It might have been them, right, and we see that, but otherwise they're dramatically homogeneous to any other surrounding people. This broader, by late antiquity, this broader Thuringian, Merovingian kind of Elbe material culture that stretched basically all over Central Europe. The Longobards are not properly Eastern Germans. They're Elbe Germans, such as the Alemanni, such as the Bavarians, right? So much, in fact, their language was similar today now it's distinguished, but we know it because settling in Italy, they became literate early enough to maintain certain Germanic idioms within the same Latin prose. So we know what it was like. It was beautiful, terribly fascinating language, violent as much as they were, hissing. He was something that for these people were still believing in the idea that the strongest had every right to rule. They were evil, right? They praised evil as a virtue. They were Woden's adoptive sons. That was their deal, right? That's where the Longbeards in the myth, there was a myth of people, not a myth of kings, right? But because these were so bulkily non-dynasticized, right? Even Albavin was just a random leader that, not so random, because also in here, as you will understand, the Romans had catalyzed the emergence of this first among equals, but still, aside from the fact that Albavin himself was assassinated together with Byzantine complicity, but there is this moment of anarchy for a good 10 years that reflects rather the fact that the Longobards didn't have any kind of monarchic unity per se. In 489, they had settled north of the Danube, and some years later, they moved east, settling in the old Roman Pannonia. So roughly the territories of today's Hungary. But we find stuff all around. There are beautiful Bosnia. There is a church in Bosnia of the time that has full Tarkin script that may be not Gothic, but actually Longobard. There are very important. There are few traces, right? Their land was Moravia for a longer time. They were on the move, though. Their mindset was not territorial yet. That is something that they acquired only when they settled in Italy, when they began to recognize properly a geographical unity of the land. They were a warlike people, as we were saying. The Roman historiographers said that they distinguished themselves for their wild nature among all the other barbarian people, so much that Tacitus had defined him more ferocious of the Germanic ferocity. And it's apparently a real thing, in a sense. They were, as we were saying before, strong people. During the Gothic War, where they were warring against the Gepids in the Pannonian Plain, they had the strength to send to Italy in help of the Romans, because they were allied with them, 2,500 warriors with their retinues. Meaning also here that, these were also equestrian peoples in a sense. They had not properly Reitervölker as, were not steppe people, but for, the Germanic average, they surely knew how had important numbers. And this idea of the retinue is literally a crypto chivalry, crypto knightly, idea of that was very imbued in peoples like the Goths, the Longobards, that was respected also later on by the Franks, even when they had surpassed them in cavalry development. The idea that the freeman was a horseman, right? This is something that is often overlooked, because objectively, yes, the Germans, especially the ones of the north and the west, didn't have much nor dramatically strong cavalry, but in their mindset, and this is something that goes back to the common Indo-European background, the Caucasus of the steppe, the warrior, the freeman, is a horseman, right? And everything of the view of the world, etc., is connected to the sword, to the horse, to the tonic, and the Uranic symbolism, and that's what they would maintain even on the longer run, when eventually with sedentarization they wouldn't actually develop quite a professional cavalry, but still having that ideal in mind. They had fought in Italy at the orders of Narcissus, so after Belisarius, but they apparently they fought, okay, we can't digress on the relations between the Byzantines and the Longobards at that point, but let's say they had sent back home. Here the sources are a bit divergent, saying basically that they were so violent, right? Especially towards the civilians, that the Byzantines had disciplinary problems to maintain them. Even here, it fuels the myth of the Longobards were bloodthirsty motherfuckers, but the idea is, that basically everybody did like that. And just the fact that this contingent was very strong and very proud of himself, and kind of, unwilling to compromise, right? They were allies, but yes, what is an ally at this point? Everything that is an ally for in this Byzantine view, for anybody else, by the way, is potential enemy. So much that, as it will happen eventually, at certain point, the Romans were preoccupied of the fact the Longobards would become too strong, especially when they began to beat the Gepids. So they backed the Gepids instead before they had switched. From the previous alliance, but the important thing is that the Longobards got this first taste of Italy, right? That in spite of the massive distractions that had taken place during the Gothic War and that had ravaged this land in an unimaginable way, we're still rich, right? We're still populated, urbanized, etc. So even after this big crack, the Longobards thought better that Italy was kind of better than Hungary, and they some of them actually remained there. There is some evidence that suggests that part of the Longobard veterans had actually remained in the peninsula and had been settled by Narcissus in southern Italy, so that the southern duchies, the one of Beneventum, would have actually predated the Longobard migration in the north and the establishing of the kingdom. This would be reflected also by a certain particular type of titles, such as the one of Comes, that didn't quite exist in the Longobard, that were about the duchess, right, mostly in the north, but this is not maybe, but that tells you about the permeability of these troops, these bands that would simply go out of their homes to seek glory and fortune, and there's plenty of massive evidence of Longobard presence in the Byzantine frontiers for a long time to come, fighting also against the same Longobards of Italy at some point. In 568, by order of Justinian II, Narcissus was substituted in the Italian government by the prefect Longinus. Now, it's not entirely clear what's the motivation and migrated in Italy. We will talk about it in detail. People like to make it easy. They say that since the Avars had begun to migrate into the Carpathian Basin, they had crushed the Gepids in conjunction with the Longobards, with whom they had allied, also in kind of anti-Byzantine fashion, because the Gepids, as we've seen at that point, had become the protege of the Romans. After that, they had switched the thing, had been initially one of the Longobards against the Gepids. And so everybody says, yes, because the Avars were the dramatic military machine, the Longobards were so weak. There is kind of a bit of bias towards that. This is not entirely true. No doubt the Avars were considered by the Romans the most military powerful of the barbarians, of the barbaroi. But at the time of the migration in the Carpathian Basin and in Pannonia, where they began to border the Longobards for sure, in fact there were surely Avars even among the Longobards when they migrated into Italy, there was no Khaganate, right? The Avars were still divided, fragmented. They were not, in that sense, the cohesive military machine that will aggress the Roman Empire in the following generation, right? So, of course, the Longobards were not happy of having this neighbor, the new neighbor, but there is no actual evidence of the fact that they migrated into Italy because the Avars came. Of no type, right? No evidence at all. On the contrary, these were still formerly allies. So much we know actually that when Albavine was preparing the migration into Italy, he signed a treaty with the Avars saying, if the migration fails, we will, we make this deal for which we can't come back to Pannonia, and you won't have nothing to say about that. Of course, at that point, the Avars probably would have not given a damn, and also because if the Longobards had failed the migration, probably it would have not been so so strong to cope with the Avars in the same ground, but let's say it was still a condition of parity, right? As we've seen, the in 567 the Gepids had been knocked out, actually more by the Longobards. Like the Avars mostly finished the job, right, and helped them, of course, but also in here they were not the superpower that would become later. So that had occurred indeed, as we've seen, as an anti-Roman thing, right? The Gepids were Roman allies, so the fact that the Longobards had crushed them, of course, doesn't speak for very, peaceful and easy relations with the Byzantines. But all the information we have about the Longobard migration suggests, overwhelmingly, in my opinion, that the Longobards had basically been called in Italy by the same Romans, for the simple reason that when they entered the Po Valley, there was no opposition of sort, right? This was not a brutal war, was not an invasion in the military sense. These guys literally migrated into the Po Valley. The Byzantines retained certain strongholds, but there was no movement. Even in Constantinople there, the mobile armies were somewhere else, and they didn't make a move, however, to go to Italy to salvage, an alleged, their territories from an alleged invasion. There is no evidence. The state of documentation is simply disgusting for these times and places, because here we're talking about the end of the 6th century. What the hell do you think we have about these times? And there are legions and other stuff that kind of deviated, I would say, a healthy historical reason. For example, there is, since the 7th century, actually there's this old legion according to known as Narcissist Legion, according to which the eunuch that had, as we've seen, been substituted by Longinus would have basically been triggered by Justin's II decision, and since he had been also threatened by the courtly faction, he would have called allegedly the Longobards into the Italian peninsula. This thing doesn't find any credit in modern historiography, if anything, also because when Narcissus died, the Romans made him a state funeral, and you don't make a state funeral with that pomp and that display for somebody who has literally betrayed the empire, making foreign people invading it without permit. It's complete nonsense. It doesn't exist historically from any stretch of the imagination. What we know is that the entire Longobard people, that as we've said were many, right, were even larger than the Ostrogoths altogether when they migrated, together strengthened in that sense with other barbarian contingents, because this is how it normally happened. For example, the Longobards had a great feeling with the Saxons. They were friends, and there were 20,000 Saxons allegedly who migrated into Italy, albeit coming back to the north when the Longobards tried to assimilate them, that is, to impose them essentially the Longobard law on their Saxon customs. But it was plenty of Thuringians, Swabians. We have seen it. Agilulf, for example, the future Longobard king, was actually Duke of Turin, was of Thuringian origin. There were other that the Longobards had adopted that eventually from the from the Swabians, for example, that switched eventually signed to the Byzantines. There were things like that. There were other groups of not better specified populations, as we were saying before, Huns, Slavs, other Germans, of course, and so on. The Gepids, that Longobards, by the way, had also in part assimilated, deported, famously enough. The Rosmunda was the daughter of the Gepid king that being decapitated by the same Albvin, and according to the legend, the Longobard king made obliged his wife to married, and because that was completely normal actually to drink from her father's skull, and that's a bit of a kind of a evil Christianized legion, but it was normal for those peoples to drink from the skull of their killed enemies. It was actually a compliment, because you don't drink from the skull of any, slave you destroy. You drink just from the skull of the most powerful people, of the most powerful enemy you ever slaughtered, right? And also, you marry your his daughter, and that was naturally aimed at strengthening the fusion between the Longobards and the Japanese. Completely normal stuff. I mean, if you have ever read Norse sagas, you know that this was actually already a more civilized context, but it's all about incest, fratricides, pretty messed up work, but still that they worked for actually logical reasons that are not to be laughed about just because it sounds weird to us, right? It was a specific aim there, even to maintaining a certain clinic unity and so on. But anyhow, the Longobards entered Italy from the Julian Alps, traditionally in May of 568. Probably the Longobards we're not 100% sure about the date. Surely these were such large amount of people that probably migrated also in different years over time. But they, however, entered the Venetian plain without meeting any strong reaction from Byzantine side. As we've seen, the Imperials basically limited to defense certain strongholds that remained in possession of. For example, I don't know, that there were Ostrogothic garrisons that had been basically left by the Byzantines at the end of the Gothic War, where they had found them to be part of the right, that these joined the Longobards. Let's say, there is here naturally the obvious realization that even if the Byzantines had called the Longobards in, this people was not to be controlled in any way, right? Consider that it had been the plague, right? That Italy had been depopulated. Mobile armies were employed by imperials on other fronts. There was no centralized command in Italy after the removal of Narcissus that could have, in that sense prevented, even if the Byzantines had wanted any kind of reaction, of response, right? But it's really easier to believe that the Byzantines, of course, knew about this, because if a people migrates, it doesn't happen from a day to another. These people knew perfectly well what the hell was going on, and it would make very much sense to believe that the Longobards were actually allowed by Constantinople to settle in the Po Valley in anti-Merovingian function. This was an issue. We also made a video about the so-called Atlantic perspective of the Justinian reconquest. The Romans had pretty serious problems encountering the Frankish expansionism, right? If anything, also historically speaking, in Europe, Byzantines and Franks would come to clash again only when the Longobards were removed, because they were in the midst of the way. Consider that the Franks and the Alemanni at the very end of the Gothic War had exploited the general mass to launch a raid up to southern Italy, where they were eventually defeated by the Imperials. So they had already showed pretty well that Italy was permeable at that point. So moving the Longobards into northern Italy, that was the least developed area at the time, even though it had actually some of the largest cities of the empires, we'll see now, there by sheer size of, was not the center in the south that traditionally were the most developed. At this point that the Romans retained control partly. As we'll see here, the thing got out of hand. So we're not saying that the Longobards were so friendly. The Longobards didn't give a damn, right? They didn't even have a kind of a conscious idea what they were doing, right? The kings, the elites did, right? They were already Christian. They were Arian. But the rest of the people were, we know it, even just, if you look at many Italian toponyms, they still maintain the name of Fara, that was from the Germanic Fahren, it was a Fachgemeinschaft, a community of travel. These were autonomous clans in everything, militarily, logistically, etc. They moved just what the bigger people moved, and they didn't care very much about authority. When the Longobards migrated into Italy, they largely didn't even have a realization what Italy was concretely about. As we will see, some would even cross the Alps and go into Burgundy. Others would, before they settled down, to calm down, things would happen. But the most important thing is that there is no evidence, and this is possibly the most important thing, of any destruction / violence / massacre / persecution, whatever, of anyone at the moment of the Longobard settlement, right? The only thing that happened pretty messed up when, autonomous dukes invested certain areas that were garrisoned by the Romans, right, and were properly Roman territory, and began there just to raid, right, and then to eventually come back where they had settled in the same Italy. And that is a very different thing. That is to say, you don't destroy the place where you have to settle and live on, right? You just do where there is somebody else that controls it. And that's how also the wars against the Romans began. But even in there, the destructions were carried out by both sides, because guess what? War is made in the same exact way by everybody, but there is no evidence of any sort that the Longobards, by entering all these northern cities and also settling in others, they actually carried out any destruction, unless they were opposed, right, in arms, which, as we've seen, didn't happen, and unless there was any garrison that was meant to maintain control, broadly speaking, or had the power to counter them, right, and otherwise, it doesn't make any sense. You don't destroy a country where you actually have already moved. The Longobards didn't destroy Italy, right? Italy was already destroyed by the Gothic War. If anything, it just created, as we will see now, given the fact that the Longobards initially had the strength altogether, if they had been united politically, if they had been truly cohesive nationally, they had easily the power to conquer all Italy in one blow. They didn't do it because they were all fragmented. So the main problem was the creation of what we will describe in a moment, of this extremely irregular frontier throughout all the whole peninsula that basically created certain war zones that would, reactivate on a regular base, even though there wasn't this atrocious hatred between the two sides. Actually, Italy, especially the more time it went, was drifting away from the empire. So actually, even the same Byzantine-held areas in Italy were kind of growing similar to the rest of the country, and there was a lot of mutual, and there was an osmosis, there was an hybridation in there for sure, also with the Longobards, and there is not such the drama of the terrible barbarian invasion has been depicted by, just for mainly for ideological reasons, simply for the fact that at some point, yes, this big people had settled there, and control on, the Po Valley couldn't be resumed. The Byzantines would try that, but what we know, what was happening locally there is that the Romans, the Longobards were actually organizing something with the local population in terms of administration of an actual kingdom, of something that worked eventually and got the upper hand in Italy. So something very, very different from, and raids, etc., are only in the Roman-held territory, not at the moment of the settlement where these guys basically. There is also, for example, the siege of Pavia. Some say, there was a 3-year siege. It's seemingly an historiographical invention by sources that wanted to essentially replicate the topos of the 3 years siege of Ravenna by Theodoric against Odoacer. Pavia is also the major cities out there, Milan, Verona, etc., were not besieged. They simply opened the gates to the Longobards. So we should be extremely careful about what this practically means, right? And there would have been no reason for the Byzantines at that point, without no army there, to even exasperate this situation. What for, right? And as we were saying before, the Italian populations were actually largely fed up with Byzantine government, and they were much more open to the Longobard way, let's say, in terms especially of freemanship and medium property owner. And the myth also that here the Romans were discriminated, it's completely false, right? The reason why this was believed by the old by very old historiography at this point, it was that since in later sources the Romans never appear, in the Longobard kingdom. It was assumed that they were so oppressed that nobody, it's as if they didn't even exist, right? The truth is that those people had become Longobard, juridically speaking. So everybody was Longobard, so much that, this is pretty evident also in the rest of Italian history, where these people were called unanimously Longobards, and there was no distinction even, and the later ones come mostly from the 8th century, the end of the kingdom, when the Longobards finally conquered areas that had remained Byzantine for a longer time, such as Ravenna, for example. So where there were important figures, merchants, people with money that were nominally Roman from a legal point of view, and now the Longobards were basically, also taking protection or taking care of from, if you look at Heistolf's laws, that they're basically about that, because they also make them cash money at that point, because Longobard Italy was not dramatically dynamic from an economical point, but we're talking about the very early Middle Ages, and a reality that actually was richer per capita than all the rest of the world, because Italy did maintain that uninterruptedly from Roman times to the end of the 17th century. So even in here, we shouldn't be tricked. Like in Gaul, for example, it was surely richer than Italy, but people had it much worse, right? Because wealth was concentrated just in the hands of very few, while the rest were serfs. Same goes a bit like in Spain, but in Italy, it was much similar to Anglo-Saxon England, because these countries had been literally devastated by something, and the invading Germans managed to recreate something from scratch on a more orderly base with a less privatized system, because the latifundium had disappeared, and therefore strengthening kingship, right? So it's not surprised that the Longobards and the Anglo-Saxons has actually pretty good administration historically, even with two different timings and developments. The Longobards naturally had it dramatically much speedier, but the key here is realizing that the trauma had already happened. The Longobards didn't make it worse. Surely they made it worse for Byzantine government, but we know also how historically went. The Byzantines basically said, at this point, considered Italy just as a peripheral province. They didn't give it more than much about that. And also, that's why by the mid-7th century, they surrendered to the fact that, the Longobards were there. They also got the upper hand and stopped any major attempt to recover those lands. Mm-hmm. So the invasion took place fundamentally like this. Albovin took possession without fighting of Cividale, of Friuli, Forum Iuli, that has been founded by Julius Caesar, where probably existed the seat of a frontier duchy. He left here his nephew with all his cavalry, the Marpais, that was kind of the marshal of the Longobard army. Also because the northeastern Longobards, the Austrians, so-called, because they had, like in Francia, there was Neustria and the Franks had Austrasia, the Longobards Austria, but it was basically the same thing, was always more exposed to eastern troubles, like Slavic, Avar raids, etc. So it was the most warlike area, a bit less urbanized, maintain a bit more the truer Longobard ethos, whereas, the Longobards that settled in Lombardy and in Tuscany were instead more quickly Romanized, more civilized, if you want, but also lost their military, aptitude habits earlier. So then Albovin went on to Treviso. The bishop made act of submission. That's where also the Ostrogoths joined, the local garrison. Eventually, the king moved to the west, conquering Vicenza, Verona, and the major centers of northern Italy, including Milan, that fell on September the 3rd, 569. Mm-hmm. And at the beginning of the 570s, thus, the Po region, comprehended between the Alps and the river, had been subdued, except for, allegedly, for Pavia. That's, as we were saying before, allegedly resisted to the Longobard siege up to 572, but there is no actual evidence of this thing having taken place. There's no sign of destruction, archaeologically speaking. It's just a line on a manuscript, and we can legitimately think it was just a historiographical topos paralleling the siege of Ravenna in 489. Pavia, as you know, would become the Longobard capital, so there was also this prestige attached to the Palatium, to the idea that this was a real capital. These were real centers, like cities like Milan, like Verona, were some literally the largest extensionally in the whole Roman Empire, right? So they were also very imposing and important infrastructure. The local communities had their own sense of municipality, of prestige, even something already preluding to the communes of the low Middle Ages. There is enough epigraphic evidence of this. Then the Longobards seized only over the years certain other centers such as Susa or the Insula Comacina. There were certain another Venetian and some Venetian strongholds that had remained to the empire. But even in here, there is no evidence of fight. The Insula Comacina on the Como Lake, for example, we know that the Byzantine strong garrison and the Longobards on the shores coexisted for years, and the passage of power eventually was peaceful, right? So this supports even more the idea of a prearranged migration. Albovin was assassinated in 572. The story goes that he was assassinated by his wife, and her lover was a squire, and there is some Byzantine interference. Probably yes. Probably he was actually assassinated in a plot to which the prefect Longinus was not extraneous, but the rest is a legend. But of course, because this is part of Germanic epics, like the story of the warrior, as the Germanic era always dying in a kind of a lame fashion, like with the sword tied to the bed. It is the symbol of manhood. Assassinated with a betrayal. It's always the same old story. But what is important is rather the figure, because he was more like a leader of men. He was not a king proper. He was a leader properly in the migration Germanic sense. Was a charismatic figure that had managed to exalt the Longobard fantasies of seizing these fertile lands and becoming powerful and so on. But after his death, there was no true succession. The Longobards elected their kings, because it was the assembly of the people, and this would remain formally, nominally, legally true till the end of the kingdom. That still functioned pretty well. Other myth completely invented from a historical point of view, and today historiography has clarified it, that the Longobards had, they were fragmented, that there was no unity. This is completely false, right? The only moment where this happened was the initial anarchy between 574, 584, that made impression in historiography. Then there is the very last year, after 200 years, this idea that the Austrians were not satisfied with the Neustrians because the last king, Desiderius, had been elected with papal and Frankish money. Therefore, from these two examples, was the idea that the Longobards were always divided, all these duchies were independent. That's total bullshit. Like, there is no evidence of any sort. From authorities onward, nobody ever put in discussion among the Longobards, the Longobard kingdom, and the only clashes that existed there were between individual dynasts to rise to the throne, and there was no denial, no evidence, not even one, of any historical type about the fact that the Longobards didn't believe to be part of a kingdom, and that they were fine with that, and that this thing went on without basically trouble, because, there was nothing to usurp. It was an elective system. Power was in the cities. The North had managed to create this, functional system that encompassed the Po Valley and Tuscany. And yes, the southern duchies were kind of more detached because there was the Byzantine stripe, as we will see in the middle. But a Beneventan duke became king at some point, was simply elected like that, and there were very strong ties even with the north, especially the northeastern Benevent. Paul the Deacon is a very good example of that. And the only duchy maybe that makes exception, because they always tried to sneak out and with the support of the Byzantines, were the Duchy of Spoleto that was into the mount, into the Apennine, the heart of the Apennines. For the rest, there is no clash between chunks of the Longobard King. That's a complete historiographical fabrication that is being buried by at least 70 years. Nobody believes in it anymore, if not the people out there that invent this for sheer ignorance of actual history. But, who cares about history, right? But that's literally how things happen. And buying the same old story that the Longobards were just a bunch of brutal monsters that destroyed everything. And they didn't destroy good nothing. They created the most advanced politically and civically and juridically, advanced, in fact, kingdom in Western Europe. And this is the only historical evidence that we have. And the sheer, I stress it, the sheer amount of ignorance of Europeans in general about this chapter of their own history is utterly disgusting. It's something we should make a collective atonement for, because it's not possible that in 2021 we don't even have the ABC of early medieval history. And I'm utterly shocked sometimes by this. And people go by mood. Right, Byzantines and popes writing that these were bad people because, of course, they were in full war against them at some point. You see, the Longobards are the barbarians. Do you know anything about how they actually were? Do you know what they were doing at the time? Do you have their own voices? Do you have their own script? We actually do, right? And if you read them, if you study the development, the civil development, the juridical development, the administrative development, you would think twice before believing this stuff, right? After Albvin, the Longobards elected a king named Clef, who was assassinated, however, shortly afterwards, not even after 2 years. So from this time on, as we were saying before, there was literally, a decade of anarchy, known as Ducal Anarchy, in fact, because the Longobards didn't elect a king. And this was a deliberate choice. As we've seen, they did it twice, right? They were at this point simply governed by their own dukes, that of course tried to carve their own power on their own. But the anarchy didn't slow down the conquest of Italy. That went towards different directions, in the north, in the center, and it arrived in depth with the creation of the duchies of Spoleto and Benevent. As we were saying before, there are actual claims that the Duchy of Benevent was formed already by this Longobard presence that existed in local stronghold, etc. It's possible, yes. So basically Italy, however, gets permeated by these bands that, of course, when they meet, in the center, in the south, a more consistent Roman presence that opposes them fight and raid, right? But when they come back home, a few tens of kilometers away, in the same Italy, they think about developing that place, not destroying it. Again, I stress it. In 578, the Longobards seized Classe, that was the port of Ravenna, and the following year, Rome itself was besieged. The Longobards never managed to take Rome, but they offended it multiple times, even with impressive skills, frankly. And the empire attempted at this point a counteroffensive in great style around 576 at the work of the Curopalate Baduarius, that was the son-in-law of the same Justinian, Justin II, who met the invaders on the field, but was defeated, right, and dying shortly afterwards, perhaps because of the wounds received in battle. So here we're talking about actual military activity that we're not dramatically documented about, but we know was pretty intense between the Longobards and the Romans. And here we don't digress talking about how similar these, troops were in a sense. How the fact that the Longobards themselves had served in the Roman army, the fact that, of course, also the Romans there were using the same Longobards actually as allies most of the time. So, but pretty intense warfare in a land. Basically, all southern Europe, in terms of battleground, is pure nightmare. Like, Spain is nightmare, Italy is nightmare, the Balkans are nightmare, right? So this was a ferocious frontier struggle, right, that went on in these two areas that we're defining here, that at this point were still very fluid. Baduarius' expedition, about which we know basically nothing, put momentarily an end to counter in open ground the Longobards at that point. And the empire therefore limited itself to exist in the most impregnable fortresses, and in particular in the coastal cities that could be resupplied by the fleet. This is a trend that already starts here, that would remain historically in the Longobard-Byzantine dimension of the Italian struggle, but also for, after the end of the Longobards, for Italy in general, and the Byzantine presence. I mean, the Byzantines stays on the coasts, right? Especially in the south. Cities, this maritime empire that can be resupplied with large communities still speaking Greek and having this properly still Roman culture in practice. The hinterland, the continental dimension, the countryside remaining Longobard. So we're talking about boundaries of a few tens of kilometers that, however, stretch throughout all the whole peninsula, beginning to separate two worlds, in a sense. Also in here, we don't have to be too excessive, meaning that these worlds were so literally different from one another, but still there were two different models of military organization, the internal one being much more similar to the broader Latin Germanic reality that would exist, in general. So this was true also during Carolingian times, when the Carolingians conquered the Longobard kingdom. They basically overlapped the system against the Byzantines. It was pretty much the same. And so on. The Franks not being much of a land power, the Germans in general at this point not being. Albeit the Longobards at this time actually carried out some act of piracy against Sardinia. They seized actually Roman galleys and in the major ports, for example the one of Pisa. There are interesting letters from Gregory the Great warning the Caloritan bishop in Sardinia, saying watch out because these guys are running around. At a certain point, Corsica, we don't know when, but fell under Longobard control. It was probably something very gradual over time, but that's how blurred sometimes our knowledge of this reality is. So the war effort on other fronts didn't allow Maurice to send an expeditionary corps, and he was obliged to cope with the Longobard danger with alternative solutions. The most promising seemed the alliance with the Franks, that, as we've seen, had already intervened in Italy in various ways, and also with scarce results, and also through the institution of the Exarchate, that was a new political and military structure formed also in Africa in the same years. The seat was Carthage in there, that contributed to reinforce the Byzantine system of defense. We made a video on Byzantine Italy in which we explained a bit this reality. But basically the Exarchates were an administrative regime consisting in the militarization of the territory, in which in force of the state of permanent war, the traditional subdivision between military and civilian authority ceased, right, and thus all the power passed into the hands of the exarchs that governed the provinces through military chiefs that depended on them. This is very important because, in a certain sense, it's a prelude to the themes. This separation ceased, and was a more unitary, emergential command of the situation. So the institution of the new magistrate, so the Exarch of Italy, or of Ravenna, because the seat was more importantly that former administrative capital of Italy in the first place, had place probably around 584. On the Exarch figure were attributed exceptional powers that he exercitated through magistri militum, duces, and tribuni that were put respectively at the guide of operational units, of military governors, and of cities. And the civilian authorities didn't disappear completely, though, but they found themselves in a subordinate position towards the military commanders that interfered in all the branches of public administration, and the Ravenna's Exarch's authority was extended over what basically remained of Italy at this point to the Byzantines, that is more or less 1/3 of the peninsula, except Sicily and Sardinia, that historically were not part of Italy, so they had remained under other jurisdictions. So the exarchs were chosen directly from by the sovereigns among the the palace dignitaries, and to the title of function they united the patrician dignity that therefore posed them at the highest levels of the nobiliary hierarchy, and that's how important they were. They were often eunuchs because, according to the mentality of the time, if you were castrated, you couldn't, you were physically unfit, so you couldn't usurp the throne in Constantinople. The thing objectively worked. This was a suggestion maybe evoked by things the history of ancient Rome, but it was in Constantinople it was believed that a man was thus mutilated, let's say, could not exercise the supreme public office, and for this reason the choice of an eunuch limited substantially the dangers for central power. Our information on the governors of imperial Italy are very scarce. Right, at this point of research, it's basically impossible to establish, a safe list, nor to fix exactly even a chronology. Sometimes we don't even know about who they were, how many they were. That they might have been 24, including those that actually repeated at the same office, and chronologically distributed between 584 and 751. Right. Today, by the way, we stopped to the early 7th century because the history of Byzantine Italy is rather long. So we basically stopped now to the actual boundaries that established on a longer run between the Longobards and the Byzantines. Bearing in mind that before the Frankish conquest, the Longobards were about to seize basically the whole peninsula, right? And they, of course, occupied major chunks, including Ravenna, later on in the 8th century. But the boundaries are basically as it follows. So the borders of the Italian exarchate are not easily definable because they went subject to continuous adjustments. For the obvious, and mostly incessant conflictuality between the Longobards and the Byzantines. So the scarcity of historical sources furthermore renders, also in here, very difficult their own reconstruction. The imperial domination was, as we have seen, more than else limited to the coastlines and to a small hinterland, while the Longobards had firmly established in the more internal territories. And Constantinople was in fact capable of fueling through, let's say, supplying through the fleets the coastal cities without being countered by the enemy that didn't own, as we were saying before, an adequate maritime capacity. There was never an actual Longobard fleet. We know of course, naval operations, maritime operations probably meant. We know at a certain point the Longobards sent maritime engineers to the Bulgar Khan again to create a fleet in the Black Sea against Constantinople, but they costed too much, and the Longobards had mostly terrestrial interests. So they controlled coastal cities as well, especially from the 7th century. They seized Liguria, other places, but also in Tuscany. But so they were mostly a Tyrrhenian power, by the way. Even though because the Adriatic was a bit a Byzantine thing, but it was also harassed by Slavic piracy, so they left it to the Byzantines that also controlled the lagoons in the northeast, Saint Ravenna, and so on. So they were not interested in investing there, given that also the kingdom was mostly shifted towards the northwest, right? It is a center of power. The Italian coastal cities had this labor force, surely knew its own deal about maritime stuff, but simply the Longobards didn't invest in it because, once again, they were most about land power for strategical reasons. So we don't have to be surprised. It just had a potential, though. So the Romans wouldn't be challenged on the seas by the Longobards, right? They didn't need at the time, and on the contrary, they were very. At a certain point, after the Islamic invasions, they mostly concentrated their power on Sicily. They had other things to think about, quite frankly. And towards the end of the 6th century, the Exarchate of Italy included the following territories that were sometimes separated one from the others, right? They were just connected via sea. And this is important because they're literally islets sometimes revolving around the major coastal cities, city walls, and so on, so they could be defended mostly in the south. So the Byzantines owned the Ligurian littoral that would be conquered by the Longobard king Rotary around 643, and for a while part of the Tuscan coast. Then Histria and part of the Venetia. So of the ancient Roman province of Venetia and Istria had remained to Constantinople just the coastal territories and the hinterland, Monselice, Padua, that would fall respectively Longobard hands in 601 and 602, Mantua, that became Longobard in 603, Oderzo, Altino, and Concordia. Oderzo, that was the seat of an imperial duke, was taken by the Longobards around 640 together with Altino. Concordia was Longobard in 591, eventually was reconquered by the Romans and definitely lost to the Longobards around 615. With the fall of these strong, terra firma strongholds, the Imperials maintained just the lagoon areas where the city of Venice would have been formed, right? And the first phase of the Longobard conquest had already caused a shift, a migration of the hinterland populations to the lagoons, right? And in search for safety. And the phenomenon became massive with the gradual loss of the last imperial strongholds. Venice was populated. I mean, the areas of the islands of the lagoon were populated since ancient times, right? But this process favored the creation properly also with the dukes, which would become the Doge in the Venetian, was part of the Venetian government, this local administrative reality that would evolve into Venice and autonomize itself from the Byzantines at some point, but still ideally, in fact, never being part of the Holy Roman Empire as such, because even in later times, because ideally it was still Byzantine, even when, Constantinople was conquered by the Turks and so on. The inhabitants of Aquileia passed to Grado, that was already by 568, so immediately the Longobards would launch raids across the stripe that connected the two cities that were very important episcopal centers, because one was they were basically the emanation of Aquileia. Grado was the emanation of Aquileia for the Romans, right? Whereas in Aquileia there was the Longobard bishop. So sometimes there was also this, let's say, competition between the two centers in terms of ecclesiastical policy between the papacy and the Longobards. And there were very interesting things about that happening. Actually, at some point we will talk about them. Eventually, there would be the migrations from Padua to Malomocco, from Concordia to Caorle, and from Altino to Torcello, and from Oderzo to Eraclea. So this was all basically the migration of Romans initially to, from Longobard held territories into these more easily defendable areas. Eraclea, was also known as Eracliana or Città Nova, would be built at the time of Heraclius at the extreme limit of the lagoon, in order to cope with the threat represented by Oderzo, that and this center would remain for 1 century the seat of the Byzantine regional government. Then, so this was the Venetian era. Then the Byzantines held also the properly said exarchate, with the center in Ravenna. It was a major city, was easily defendable with lagoons, etc. Eventually, historically, in the 8th century, the Longobards wouldn't even need a siege to seize it, because they took it politically. They opened the gates, so let's say no. But it was easy to defend. And it basically controlled, from there, the territories of today's Emilia-Romagna. In Italy, Romagna takes the name, perhaps you know it, from the fact that it was Romania, literally. So it was the Byzantine Empire, the land of the Romans, whereas Lombardy takes the name historically from the Longobards. This region in northern Italy, on the right bank of the Po River, was also very intensely hit in the early years by warfare between the Longobards and the Byzantines, because basically it was the area between Lombardy and Romania. So in here there were ferocious struggles, cities razed to the ground. For example, at the town of Brescello, people say, "Oh, you see, so the Longobards destroyed." Yes, because that was a scorched earth strategy, and they mostly razed the walls to the ground, etc., in order to not to defend it anymore. But that what happens in a frontier and war zone, right? In the respective areas were kind of fine, right? It was relatively peaceful. Then there was the so-called Duchy of the Pentapolis, that was subdivided in this is all the Latin names, in Pentapoli Marittima and Pentapoli Annonaria. The first including Rimini, Pesaro, Fano, Senigallia, and Ancona, and so basically the coastal area, and the latter, Urbino, Fossombrone, Iesi, Cagli, and Gubbio, is the continental, the Apenninic one. So the Pentapoli Annonaria was fortified carefully by the Byzantines, so much to deserve the name of Provincia Castellorum, so the province of castles. And this is pretty evident because of the mountainous character of the same, and it had a very great strategic importance. By Fossombrone in the 8th century, the Byzantines ambushed the Longobards that managed to fence off the attack, together with the Longobards of Spoleto that had betrayed them as well, passed to the Byzantines. These were very tough terrains, but very tough terrains. Even if you forests, mountains, etc. So very, very important also from a strategical point of view. Then the Romans controlled the Abruzzese littoral. The Byzantine presence, in which is witnessed until up to the beginning of the 7th century. This would pass eventually to the Longobards. Then there was the so-called Duchy of Perugia. Perugia, was it's in the heartland of the Apennines in Umbria. And this is the possession of this city was considered of vital importance for the Byzantines. Why? Because it allowed the communications between Rome and Ravenna. After that, the track of the ancient Via Flaminia had been interrupted in more spots by the Longobards of Spoleto, that were still, however, hostile also to the Byzantines. Just go back, depending on the situation. So the new itinerary was, even in here, safely protected by castles, and it basically started from Rome, and it reached Perugia through the towns of Nepi, Orte, and Todi. And it eventually reached Gualdo Tadino, that is Tagine, where the battle against the Ostrogoths taking place back in the Gothic War, the defeat. Petra Pertusa, the Furlo Gorge, and from here it basically opened into the Pentapolis. So it was just a stripe that connected the region of Rome to the Exarchate, and it was, importantly enough, the only terrestrial communication between the two cities, right? And there was an important military activity, right? Because Rome had initially its properly Byzantine garrison, then eventually basically blended with the Roman militia. Ravenna had properly the largest imperial forces in Italy, so they often also supported it, especially Ravenna supporting Rome. The surrounding territories were totally in Longobard hands. Then, in fact, it was the Duchy of Rome that was constituted what remained of the ancient province of Tuscia, of Campania, and the Valeria one, was all Roman provinces. Then there was the Duchy of Naples, or of Campania, that included the coastal areas from Cuma until Salerno, the latter becoming Longobard around 640 AD. Naples was the residence of the imperial duke, and part of the province were furthermore the centers of Misenum, Pozzuoli. These were the ancient Roman military bases in the Tyrrhenian, the Castrum Lucullanum, Sorrento, Amalfi, the islands of Ischia, Procida, and Capri. So these would be the Byzantine heaven, right? These areas were very importantly influenced by, Byzantine culture, etc. Amalfi would be also one of the first, if not the first, maritime republic. And they were very compact, very difficult to reach also from land in a sense, and they could be supported by the sea. So if you don't blockade them from the sea with a fleet, the Longobards you couldn't really take them. So this was kind of a safe haven in a way. Then there were the provinces of Apollia, Lucania, and Brutzium. In Apollia, Apollia was very threatened by the Longobard Duchy of Benevent. Benevent stays in the mountains. Apollia instead is this plateau, very fertile once, and the Longobards would launch these raids in it. And the Byzantines had troubles of entering the Apennine mountains to get rid of them. So actually the Longobards would have historically the upper hand. The Byzantines, however, and for this reason, preserved mostly coastal cities, among which, in this region, Brindisi, Bari, Otranto, Taranto, and in the hinterland, just Lecce. So, however, still very much oriented towards the Adriatic. These are basically Adriatic centers, very close to the Balkans, So yeah, even in here, easily reachable by imperial forces, and surely closer also from the Tyrrhenian. Lucania found itself equally exposed to the attacks of the Longobard Duchy of Benevent. And in fact, also in here, by the end of the 6th century, the imperial domination was reduced only to the coast. In Brutzium, region that by the end of the 7th century would have taken the name of Calabria for an administrative reason, that Calabria was just basically a district of Apollia. The Byzantines shifted administration, brought it in Brutzium, and hence the name of the region historically. And here the Byzantine presence was more consistent. It maintained dominion on Reggio, Tropea, Squillace, and Cosenza that were well defended because Calabria in the north is very mountainous. It had this massive, and these centers are difficult to reach. Also, either they are coastal centers or they are in the hinterland, so the Longobards didn't go as far as that and didn't have much even of a practical interest to do it. The most fertile lands were, yes, definitely in Apollia and Lucania, and that's where they would expand the most towards. They reached, I think the Longobards reached as far as south as Rossano, which is halfway through Calabria actually, but mostly for through the coast. And for the rest, the broader objective of the Longobards would be, especially from the north, to seize the Exarchate. And the Longobards were, so as we were saying, this is not technically a video about Longobard history, but that's mostly from the imperial side. But let's say that the nucleus of the hardcore, let's say, of the Longobard kingdom was Lombardy. I would say the Po Valley, except the northern, the eastern part was kind of more autonomous, but still always conquered with Pavia, right? And Liguria and Tuscany, these were areas that basically where ducal power shrank gradually, and where royal administration was spread and everything was very compact and orderly. And it's not even surprising, these were kind of the richest areas, but also that, I don't know, in late times in communal Italy, for example, this would be the most developed urban areas, right? Because they already had this previous Longobard administration that in part had already set them orderly into this kind of, institutional mindset. Right, they were part properly of the kingdom as such. Alright, and for now we actually stop here because we made another video talking about what was happening in the meanwhile in the Balkans and in the East. So you find all this in the Byzantine history playlist. This was as far as Italy and the Longobard invasion are concerned. We will talk about a lot about what was happening in the Byzantine Empire this time, what the Longobards were doing. It's plenty of actual beautiful information about it. And for now, however, we stop here. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.